Welcome to the relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. You may have heard that Joshua versus Dubois is set to break a boxing record in the United Kingdom, as His Excellency Mr. Turki Al-Sheikh has confirmed. The capacity for Joshua versus Dubois has been extended to 96,000. Riyadh Season, Matchroom Boxing, and Queensberry have received approval to extend crowd capacity, a record for boxing at Wembley. This is set to break Tyson Fury's record, his quote-unquote record of 94,000 with Dillian White. So about 7 or 8 years ago, when Anthony Joshua's career is first starting to take off, Katie Taylor's as well, as she regularly fought on his undercards, I started to notice the crowds, the size of the crowds that would attend these British boxing matches. I mean, you will remember that 7 or 8 years ago, it really wasn't the norm for an American boxing fan to be viewing British boxing, and the American boxing scene at the time was a lot healthier then than it is now, but I noticed it then. The British boxing scene for the longest time had existed parallel to the American one, insulated, though still vibrant and thriving. Rivalries like Chris Eubank versus Nigel Benn, George Groves versus Carl Froch. These were very big fights across the pond, even if the Americans were not aware of it at the time. Anthony Joshua managed to take things to the next level, and I noticed it then. I noticed it early, what he was doing in his neck of the woods versus what Deontay Wilder was doing, then WBC champion, here in America. It wasn't hard to see that Anthony Joshua had already amassed more marquee value than Wilder, even though he was around less time. Because Wilder debuted in 2008. Anthony doesn't come into it until 2013. Deontay Wilder had a head start, but his career doesn't really start to pick up until circa 2017, 2018, as Anthony Joshua's star is rising. A demand to see the two fighters fight, the two champions, and already Anthony was already a bigger fighter, a bigger name, generating more money, more marquee value across the pond than Wilder was here in America, even though the American market was supposed to be the bigger market. Wilder was not doing here in America what Anthony was doing across the pond. He just wasn't. And that was a subject of some discussion, some debate for a very long time. Deontay Wilder's insistence that he be given half the pot. Whatever Anthony gets, he gets. Even though Anthony had more belts, more alphabet titles, and more marquee value, he and his fans demanded jointly that they should be on equal footing.
Ridiculous.
That dominated the conversation for a very long time, what was little more than just American entitlement. The American fighter feeling entitled for no reason other than he's the American fighter. You think you're special.
You thought.
You found out the hard way that you're not. Whatever marquee value Wilder was starting to amass all came to a screeching halt at the hands of Tyson Fury, subsequently Joseph Parker, and more recently, Zhilei Chang. The Joshua versus Wilder fight. And they tried to revive it. They tried to keep it alive. Anthony Joshua held up his end of the bargain. Wilder didn't. If he would have beat Joseph Parker, the next fight would have been the Joshua fight. Joseph Parker, who Anthony Joshua outpointed several years ago, several years later, proved to be too much for the Bronze Bomber.
The bronze hype job.
Though Anthony Joshua still remains. Anthony Joshua still survives, thrives. His marquee value has not left him. 3 alphabet titles and 3 losses later. The landlord still got the run of the place. In hindsight, how comical and childish it was that so many Americans could not accept that Anthony Joshua was a bigger name, a bigger marquee attraction than the American fighter. They just couldn't accept it.
They wouldn't.
Though now they don't have a choice, as there is no prominent, promising American heavyweight here and now. Wilder's finished, Jared Anderson just lost, and all the while, Anthony Joshua is still breaking records. He's set to break the attendance record at Wembley. Once again, he did it the first time with Vladimir Klitschko. He's about to do it again with Daniel Dubois. What I think are some contributing factors. Anthony Joshua's last 2 fights were not in the United Kingdom.
Nope.
The Ngannou fight, the Valine fight, large section of the British boxing community didn't get to attend those fights. The undisputed title fight between Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury. They didn't get to go to that fight either because all of those fights were in Saudi. So the British boxing fans are hungry for a big-time boxing match, and this fits the bill. Joshua versus Dubois. Anthony Joshua's already existing, marquee value, and the surge we've been seeing from Daniel Dubois, his rise. Turki El Sheikh is bankrolling this fight, and I said it weeks ago, he's going to notice a difference between doing a show in America and doing one in the UK. Crowd participation. That they had to extend the capacity for the show that they even can speaks to the health and robustness of the British boxing scene versus the American one. Because I don't think you could fill a stadium with 96,000 people for a boxing match here in America. What boxing match would draw that size crowd? Maybe Canelo versus Benavidez. I say maybe, though even with that, we're not actually on the eve of that fight. That fight is not realized. This one is. This fight is made. Joshua versus Dubois. Fantasize all you like about what you think could do something similar here in America. If it ain't made, it don't matter. Looking forward to this fight. It's just as big a fight as I thought it would be. Elsewhere in the heavyweight division, on the heels of his big win over Arslanbek Makhmudov, Guido Vianello wants Anthony Joshua or another top heavyweight. Not a guy that I paid a whole lot of attention to up until recently, his last two fights. Guido Vianello is back on track after losing 2 of his last 4 fights, and he wants that track to keep taking him forward. Vianello, 6'6", a heavyweight from Italy, turned pro a couple of years after the 2016 Olympics, where he was defeated in his opening match of the tournament. He won his initial 7 pro bouts after being held to a draw against Kingsley eBay in October of 2020. Then he notched another 3 victories before suffering his first defeat. Stopped on cuts in 7 rounds by Johnny Rice in January of last year. After 2 bounce-back wins, Vianello received the short end of a split decision against F.A. Ajagba in a fight that I saw, a fight I thought Guido won, but apparently not the judges. This past April, so when he stepped in the ring earlier this month against Arslanbek Makhmudov, who had also suffered a recent defeat, both fighters truly needed the victory if they were to keep writing their own story as opposed to being written off. And it was Vianello who inked the W, shutting Makhmudov's eye and scoring an 8th round TKO that brought Vianello to 13-2 with 1 draw and 11 knockouts. Vianello needed that victory not only for his career, but for his confidence. I really know now who I am, Vianello said in a recent interview with Louis Hart of Boxing Social. I can fight with everybody. I just need 1 name and 3 months, and I can fight with all the heavyweights. Vianello's goal is the same for pretty much every fighter who achieves at least a moderate amount of success. I really want to become a world champion, he said. I can't wait to have a new fight and train for that. The first name that came out of Vianello's mouth was former heavyweight champion Anthony Joshua, who we just talked about, who will fight Daniel Dubois for the IBF title next month at Wembley Stadium in London. We have many good heavyweights now, so there are a lot of good names, Vianello said. Let's see who gives me the best chance, because it's about giving me the possibility to fight with a top name. Now I'm taking a good ranking, so I want someone better than me. Let's see who wants to fight with me. I am ready. The fact that Guido said that there are so many good names out there, and he still mentioned Anthony by name, Anthony Joshua, speaks to what we just talked about, that whether people like it or not, Anthony Joshua is still the money man of this division. He didn't mention Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury, the winner or the loser of that fight. There are a lot of opportunities at heavyweight now, especially with Turki El Sheikh making these cash injections into the sport of boxing, doing these big shows. He could have mentioned Jarrell Miller, he could have mentioned Andy Ruiz, and you'd likely make a nice sized purse for fighting those guys on a Riyadh season show, but he didn't mention them. He mentioned Anthony. Because he's the money man. Vianello was unranked by the 4 major sanctioning bodies entering into the Makhmudov fight. That's very likely to change given that Makhmudov was registered at number 9 and number 15 by the WBC and the IBF as of mid-August. He's a blip on the radar now. And this was a fighter that I wasn't paying much attention to. I had seen Guido here and there. I think it was on Top Rank shows. I was seeing this guy, but nothing really stood out. Nothing really until his last two fights, the fight with Arslanbek Makhmudov and Efe Ajagba. For starters, I thought he did enough to win a decision. I thought he beat Ajagba, but the judges scored it for Ajagba, and it just is what it is. He definitely beat Arslanbek Makhmudov. He left no questions there. Two different approaches for two different fighters, because he was noticeably aggressive with Efe Ajagba, more aggressive at least than he was with Arslanbek Makhmudov. With Makhmudov, he was on his back foot, moving and boxing and setting up counters, then stepping in. He out-hustled Makhmudov and managed to shut his eye. That's what he did. So what you have in Guido is a guy with some size. He stands in at about 6'6", but he's not kluggy or clumsy.
Cacciatore fettuccine.
Linguini Vianello. He's not cumbersome. He seems to have good mobility, good range of motion, and he's coordinated. That seems to be a strength for him, I will admit, that his combinations are somewhat messy. He could stand to be a little bit more sharp, a bit more accurate with what he throws, but he's a good solid boxer. He's a good all-around boxer. Not particularly muscular.
Vianello.
Doesn't have overwhelming musculature, which is a good thing because that many more muscles eat up that much more oxygen in a boxing match. He's sort of lean. Not necessarily gangly or thin, rail thin like Deontay Wilder, though not having so much size that he is bogged down by it like Arslanbek Makhmudov. He is somewhere in the middle. Who wants Anthony Joshua? I don't want to be presumptuous when I say that I think Anthony can beat this fighter. I think he can. Anthony must first beat Daniel Dubois before we entertain any other conversations about him versus a guy, let alone this guy. Who should this guy fight? Let him fight Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce just dropped a decision to Derek Chisora. Joe Joyce needs a rebound fight. This guy has been beat before. He got beat by Johnny Rice. Even if he is experiencing a surge now and coming into his own, he can be beat because he has been beat. So I could go for a Vianello versus Joyce fight. I could go for that. Vianello versus Miller. Jarrell Big Gravy Miller, who's coming off that quote-unquote draw with Andy Ruiz. I could go for Vianello versus Miller. Some of these Riyadh season shows that Turkey's been doing, they could find good use for Guido Vianello. Surprisingly agile fighter, nimble. A bit of movement goes a long way in the heavyweight division because a lot of heavyweights don't have that. It's an advantage. With enough pop to do some damage, he's not the biggest puncher per se, but he punches well enough that he closed up Arslanbek's eye, did damage to that guy. See what the future holds for Guido, whether it's Anthony Joshua or somebody else. Finally, just in keeping with the theme of all things heavyweight, although now back in mixed martial arts, Francis Ngannou suggests that his boxing days are not over. After those two big paydays, just two in boxing, I don't imagine that they are. I imagine he wants to go back to making that kind of money. For most people, the shots that Francis Ngannou received square on the jaw from Anthony Joshua's right fist in March would have been enough to see that they never so much as returned to a boxing stance, much less a boxing ring. However, Francis Ngannou, a mixed martial artist and former UFC heavyweight champion, is no ordinary man. Steeled by hardship, both in his early days and even as recently as this year, Ngannou is built differently than most, and is therefore able to fight just about anybody, whether in an MMA cage or a boxing ring. It is for this reason that Ngannou, 37, refuses to give up. He refused to give up on his MMA career, despite flirting briefly with boxing, and he has refused to give up on his boxing dream. Despite being humbled in just 2 rounds by Anthony Joshua. So immediately after his performance against Tyson Fury, upsetting the apple cart in a manner of speaking, because most expected that Fury would make short work of Francis Ngannou, right after that performance, right after that fight, I said Francis had done so much better than expected, sitting Tyson Fury down, sitting him on his ass. I said to prove that Tyson Fury is an overhyped fighter, put this guy in there with Anthony Joshua and watch what Anthony does to him. You saw. Francis and many of the people in the MMA community were riding high for a number of weeks, saying this and that about the sport of boxing, up until Francis Ngannou got stopped in just 2 rounds by Anthony Joshua. Because the span of time between the Fury fight and the Joshua fight wasn't that long at all. It didn't take Anthony Joshua that long to nip this in the bud and put the MMA guys back in their place, the MMA fighter. On October 19th, Ngannou will return to mixed martial arts as expected in a heavyweight fight against Renan Ferreira, yet although back on familiar ground, he insists his latest move does not spell the end to his boxing journey. I never left MMA. Also, I haven't left boxing, Ngannou told BBC Sport. I'm not returning to MMA. I never left MMA. That's the confusion. Before he lost against Joshua in spectacular style, Ngannou shocked the boxing world with a stunning performance in a 10-round decision loss to Tyson Fury last October. Not only did he push Fury to the wire in that fight, losing only by split decision, he also dropped the now former world champion rather heavily with a hook in round 3. Indeed, it was dramatic.
Even more dramatic was when he got knocked out.
The courage he showed in lasting 10 rounds with a man many expected to toy with him, which had plenty of people, even boxing people, encouraging the Cameroonian to continue practicing the noble art and fight Anthony Joshua in Pro Bout 2. Fast forward to August, and it remains to be seen whether Ngannou stays true to his word and gets back in a boxing ring in the future. Certainly, though, if he didn't know the difference between the two sports before fighting Anthony Joshua, he knows it now.
So who would it make sense for Francis Ngannou to fight in a boxing ring when he's 0-2 in the boxing ring?
I have nothing against Francis and what he's trying to do and what he's trying to be, but make no mistake, if you put him in there with an Agit Kabayel,
He loses.
a Zile Zhang, or a Joseph Parker,
He loses.
any world-class heavyweight here and now that's on the up and up beats this guy. So if he is to return to boxing at some point at the age of 37 or 38, they're going to have to be very careful with the matchmaking. Maybe they can get him Deontay Wilder, who's coming off 2 back-to-back losses, evening the playing field, or maybe they can get him Joe Joyce, who's coming off a loss to Derek Chisora.
The bottom line is they have to tread lightly. They have to tread carefully, because he hasn't won a boxing match yet. You won a moral victory with Tyson Fury.
He did better than expected, but if he is to return to the boxing ring, he has to measure his approach.
And he's not going to return to boxing for just any amount of money. The reason he wants to get back to it is because boxing pays so much better than mixed martial arts. Otherwise, why would he bother? Why would he do it?
And so the opponent has to be somebody that fight fans are familiar enough with that you can sell the fight, but perhaps not so familiar or so on the up and up that Francis is once again in over his head in a sport that is new to him. I would recommend Joe Joyce, maybe Derek Chisora. He's approaching the end.
He's got losses in the double digits and only 2 fights left.
If you did Chisora versus Ngannou at the O2 in London, you can sell that. That's a hot ticket.
Derek has always had a cult following, more so now that he's coming off that win over Joe Joyce.
And both Derek and Francis are in their late 30s, coming up on 40. So you're not matching Francis too tough by putting him in there with Derek. You know, Derek, he'll fight anybody. And Francis, if Francis was willing to fight Tyson Fury in his first fight and Anthony Joshua in his second, I don't see why he wouldn't fight Derek Chisora.
It's worth some money.
Francis Ngannou, Derek Chisora, O2 Arena, you can sell that.